So I'm sure most of you, especially those with children, think your day actually probably begins with this question of, will my children and their children be better off than I am? I know I think about that with my daughter. And that question is at the very heart of the American dream. And for decades, that dream was realistic. You know, it was something that we looked at and we said, if you dream hard enough, you know, if you reach for the stars, all those kinds of things, you do have the opportunity to do that. But I think that calls into question more recently, is that true? Or if it is it true universally across our country? Or are there pockets where opportunity is, you have opportunity, more opportunity, and areas of the country where you perhaps have less opportunity? And as you know, here in Charlotte, we've always prided ourselves on this is a great place to live, it's a great place to move to, because we do believe that people move to Charlotte and live in Charlotte because they can do better. That's always been sort of our little mantra. We always talk about Charlotte as a meritocracy. You know, you come here, you have great skills, you'll be able to do great things. But I think some of that data that we've been seeing more recently calls into question whether that is true across the entire city and county. So for us, we didn't start with the Harvard study as a place when we started looking at this mobility issue, but certainly a lot of things came into clarity with this study. But that study starts with the premise, does a child's chances of success depend on his or her family background, and more specifically, does it depend upon where that child lives, the zip code where they live and grow up? In other words, in our country, can you really lift yourself up by your bootstraps in any place in our country, or are there places where the bootstraps go a little bit higher, the community rallies around the individuals a little bit more? And the Harvard study points to pockets of opportunity across our country, and says that, you know, there's wide variation across the country, especially in the Southeast. So Erin's actually going to go into much more detail, but this is a map that actually catches everybody's attention. And as you notice, the darker areas are those areas where mobility is lower, and the lighter areas are where opportunity and mobility is higher. And the big headline for everyone here has always been Charlotte ranked at the bottom of that list of 50 communities. I think one of the things we're very conscious about is this is a headline, and it was designed, I think, in many ways to get a headline. But what we want to think about is this an accurate portrayal of Charlotte? And if so, is it true across our county? And then if there are pockets where opportunity lags behind other areas, what are we going to do about that? But I think one of the things we want to be very careful about is pulling apart this data before we talk about what the reaction and what the response from our community will be. But the next thing that I want to show you is one of the reasons, so Harvard goes around the country showing this data, and they have a report, and as you can imagine, they show you the extremes. So the places like Salt Lake City and San Jose on one side, and they show you why those communities are at that end. And then they show, here's our predictors of upward mobility. So they say there's 5 predictors of mobility: school quality, family structure, income inequality, social capital, and segregation by race and income. They don't say that's the cause of these wide variations, but they say if we look at communities, these are the predictors that we look towards. And again, when they show you these pictures across the country, they say, well, here's what it looks like in San Jose, and here's what it looks like in Charlotte. Here's what it looks like in Salt Lake City. Here's what it looks like in Charlotte on the other end. And they oftentimes show this map. In this map, the blue represents white. The green and yellows and other colors are African American, Asian, Latino. And they show that not only as an example of segregation by race, and I would imagine by income as well when you look at that, but it's also, to me, an indicator of low social capital. In other words, it's almost structurally impossible for people from South Charlotte to get to know the issues and the people that live in those communities of that crescent, and vice versa. Those in the crescent often feel that they're not welcome in other parts of Charlotte. So to me, the map talks a lot about segregation, but it also talks about how do we bridge these sort of barriers that have been erected in our community to cross and help children and others build networks and relationships that extend outside of their zip codes. So what we've decided to do is to not necessarily dive into this and say, how are we going to solve this problem today? What we've decided to do is have a series of speakers come for the next several months and then join forces with others. I think next week and the next couple of weeks you're going to hear about a larger opportunity that might take place within Mecklenburg County and the city of Charlotte and some of the towns around this issue of mobility. But what we've decided to do is go ahead and start and have 3 speakers come to the community to give us some national expertise, with the idea that we're not going to necessarily follow everything that happens at the national level, but we're going to learn from them and then develop what we believe to be an appropriate Charlotte response based on that data. So today, I have the pleasure, I'll introduce in just a few minutes, Erin Currier from the Pew Charitable Trust. She's going to be talking about economic mobility and the American dream. 2 weeks from today, we'll have Richard Reeves at the Brookings Institute. The topic is Saving Horatio Alger, Equality, Opportunity in the American Dream. And many of you have seen the Lego video that he does where he talks about income inequality in the country. Richard will be here in December, in 2 weeks from today. Same time, by the way, 8:30. And then in January, we're going to be bringing down Sarah Haight from the Ascend Project with Aspen Institute. Likely, we're looking to confirm this date, but it'll likely be January the 27th. And a lot of what Ascend is talking about is this idea around the 2-generation model. How do you engage with parents and children at the same time to increase mobility? So again, for each of these speakers, we'll give you more information as we get closer to the event, but I hope you will mark your calendars for December the 4th at 8:30 here at the Foundation. So I want to leave you with just a couple of thoughts before I introduce Erin. As I mentioned earlier, I think that there might be an opportunity here to develop a strategic framework based around economic opportunity. So let's say for the purposes of today's discussion that everyone in this room thinks about how your organization or you personally interact in the community and you think about this issue of opportunity. And when we talk about opportunity, I want to be clear that we're talking about a couple of different pieces. One is, what are the chances for our children to move up, so low income moving up, but also, are there stressors in our community or things that are occurring in our community that create a middle-class fear about moving down? Or are there people in our community who say, I don't know if the job that I had that allowed me to have a middle-class livelihood will be here in the future, so I fear for my children's future. And it makes me a little bit hesitant to sort of embrace a community-wide effort because it doesn't reflect my children's needs. So I want to make sure that we're clear that we're not just talking about children moving up. We're talking about opportunity for all in our community and what are the barriers that might inhibit that opportunity. So I guess what I want you to think about today is there an opportunity to have one narrative in our community around this idea of economic opportunity? And can it tie together a lot of the threads that are moving? 3rd grade literacy rate, proficiency rates, college access and completion, mental health, social services, things like that. Could it all be pulled together around this idea that we want every child in our community to have an opportunity to live the American dream? And leave it up to the community to sort of build this net around them that lifts them up and builds networks and relationships. So one thing, let me give you an example here. In the past, we make a lot of grants to organizations that we think are doing great work. We never actually ask them the question, what are you doing to build social capital with the kids that are in your program? So if they complete college, what are the relationships and networks that help them get into college? If they complete high school, what are the relationships and networks that exist that enable that child to go to the college that they should go to, that's appropriate for them, the networks that will help them stay in college, and then once they come out to have references and networks to get a job that sort of leads to that, again, to that American dream. So one of the things we might look at is how do we ask different questions, not create an initiative, but ask different questions that get at the issue of social capital. I think you can think of things within your own programs and the way that you frame your work to think, how do we build a land of opportunity and cross some of these demographic barriers that we have here in Charlotte? So keep that in mind as we go through today. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Erin Currier. Erin directs the projects on family and financial security and mobility at the Pew Charitable Trust in Washington, D.C. The project conducts original research to assess differences in family balance sheets across diverse U.S. households and the degree to which Americans' short-term economic security relates to their longer-term economic mobility. As the lead of Pew's ongoing exploration of health and the status of family finances, she works with top experts in the field and oversees the project team on its comprehensive research agenda and ensures that their work is understandable. A lot of this data, again, is very complex, needs to be pulled apart. Her job is to help explain that to the American people and to those on Capitol Hill. She was recently included in National Journal's list of the 25 most influential Washington women under 35. She previously oversaw Pew's Economic Mobility Project, working to build a broad and nonpartisan agreement on the facts and figures related to mobility to encourage active debate on the ways to best improve opportunity in the United States. Before coming to Pew, she served as the acting CEO at Women Work, the National Network for Women's Employment. In this role, she oversaw the organization's federal advocacy efforts to promote economic security for women and families and coordinated all programmatic work among the national network. She has her master's degree in public policy and women's study from George Washington University and a bachelor's degree in English from the University of Michigan. And with that, I'd like to welcome Erin Currier to the stage.
Good morning. Well, I can't tell you how pleased I am to be here. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. And it's so nice. Thank you, Brian, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to the Foundation for the Carolinas for allowing me to be here today and share some of the information that we have been working on at Pew for a few years now. We have long been interested in the health and status of the American dream. And the way that we are exploring that concept is by asking questions that I know this learning series is all about. We want to know, do all Americans or all North Carolinians enjoy equality of opportunity? Does it really matter where you are born? What part of the economic ladder? What factors propel somebody up or sort of push somebody down over a lifetime and across generations? And what role should funders and community stakeholders and practitioners and advocates be playing to ensure that equality of opportunity actually exists in the United States? So today I want to do two things. First, I just want to give you an overview of what we know about economic mobility in the United States, what matters for mobility, and the factors that we think are most important for driving mobility. I also want to do a little bit of a deep dive on what is happening in Charlotte specifically, to the degree that we can with the data. And then second, I just want to share some ideas and some promising practices that may help inform your learning session as you're going on, as you're thinking about these issues and how it relates to your work. So let's jump in. Economic mobility measures the way that an individual or a family moves up and down the economic ladder over their lifetime or across generations. And so we usually measure mobility in two different ways. The first way is absolute mobility. And absolute mobility is just a measure of income change over time. So it looks at whether, if you were looking at a person compared to their parents, does that person have higher income after adjusting for inflation? We also adjust for family size. Do they have higher income than their parents did at the same age? It's usually economic mobility in terms of absolute mobility usually occurs because of economic growth. So as the economy is growing, people tend to make more money. And we think about this a lot as an escalator. If you could imagine people just standing on an escalator and the escalator slowly moves up as the economy grows, that's kind of the way that absolute mobility works. And when we look at absolute mobility in the United States, we 100% see this glass half full, because almost everybody has higher family income than their parents did at the same age. That's true across the income distribution. In fact, 93% of people raised in the bottom fifth of the income distribution exceed their parents' income. Absolute mobility tends to be a measure that is favored by those on the political right because it really looks at just income over time. Do people have more money? However, it's important to know that even while a majority of Americans exceed their parents' family income, the amount that they exceed that family income by may not actually be enough to move them to a different part of the economic ladder, and that's where relative mobility comes in. So relative mobility looks instead at where people fall on the income distribution as a whole. And if you're thinking about this across generations, it's this idea of how far does the apple fall from the tree? If a person was raised in the bottom fifth, how likely is it that they themselves remain in the bottom fifth? Or if they're raised in the middle, what are their chances of moving up or falling down? If you go back to the escalator, we think about this as people on the escalator changing positions as it's moving up. So somebody starts at the bottom of the escalator, but they're walking up the escalator as it's moving, and they might be passing people in front of them. That's sort of relative mobility. Absolute mobility may be growing regardless, but do people actually move around on the escalator at all? And this is a measure that is more typically favored by the political left because it speaks more directly to equality of opportunity. What you can see on this figure is what happens to people who are raised in the bottom fifth of the income distribution. To measure relative mobility, what we've done is divided the whole income distribution into 5 equal parts. So this bottom 20%, this is what happens to them. And what you can see is that 43% of them remain stuck at the bottom, and 70% never even make it to the middle. A mere 4% go from the very bottom all the way to the top, which means that this rags to riches ideal that we ascribe to is really more often found in Hollywood than it is in reality. It's not shown here, but a similar picture emerges for those who are raised in the top fifth. About 40% remain in the top, and less than 60% fall even to the middle. So let's put these numbers in context. Remember again that we're looking at the entire income distribution in 5 equal parts. So if your parents' background had absolutely no influence whatsoever on where you end up, you could end up anywhere on the income distribution, we would expect to see 20% in each of these rungs, not 43, not 70% below the middle. And a lot of people have seen this slide and said to me, that's not that bad. I would have expected it to be way worse. 43% stuck in the bottom seems like that's not that bad. I would have thought it would be higher. I would caution you to remember that our rates of relative mobility are lower than Canada and pretty much all of Western Europe. So the American dream, as we know it, is more often found in Europe than it is in the United States. So why do so many people experience absolute mobility but less experience relative mobility? Well, it's important to keep in mind the way that the income distribution has changed from the parents' generation to the child's generation. And I know that people in the back are not going to be able to see this slide at all, so I will explain to you what's going on here. So what you see on the left-hand side is what the parents' income distribution looked like. So that when we're talking about parents, we're talking about parents of people who are now in their 40s, about age 40. So when the parents of those people were about age 40, this is what their income distribution looked like. It was relatively compressed. Each of those color bands represents exactly 1/5 of the income distribution. Then the children's generation, which is shown on the right-hand side, and these are not necessarily parent-child pairs. This is just people in their 40s when the parents were in their 40s, people in their 40s today. You can see that the income distribution has totally widened out, and it's widened out across that income distribution, especially at the top, but it has widened out everywhere. So in order for people to actually make more money than their parents did, they have to move, they don't have to have like significant, they have to have $1 more to experience absolute mobility. But to change rungs of the income ladder, they have to have quite a bit of absolute mobility growth. And if they don't have more absolute mobility growth than their peer, they remain sort of stuck in the income slot that their parents were. In 20% of cases, families have more money than their parents did, but have actually fallen down a rung on the income distribution. Another way to think about economic mobility is in terms of wealth as opposed to in terms of income. And wealth is a really important measure that often gets sort of forgotten about. But we consider wealth to be home equity, money that you have in a savings account or retirement account. Anything other than what you're spending is considered part of your wealth, your assets. And in this way, we see similar sort of absolute wealth mobility, although less so. Only 50% of Americans have higher wealth than their parents did at the same age. And there's similar stickiness at the bottom and the top of the wealth ladders as there is for income. Again, highly complicated chart. The important point to remember, especially for those of you in the back, are that 2/3 of people who are raised at the bottom of the wealth ladder, their parents have low wealth, remain themselves stuck at the bottom of the wealth ladder. And another 2/3 whose parents have high wealth themselves have high wealth. So you see this stickiness where your parents' position really has an outsized impact on both your income and your wealth. This is the way that the wealth distribution has changed between the parent generation and the child generation, and I only show it because it is a different phenomenon than what we see with income. Income shows everybody getting sort of more money over time. Wealth is a different story in that the bottom 3 rungs of the wealth ladder have actually compressed over the last generation, and it's only people in the top 2 wealth rungs that have more median wealth than their parents did at the same age. This is a really, really important finding because especially as we think about low-income families, as we think about poverty, as we think about economic security, don't forget about wealth. Don't forget about the other side of the balance sheet, which can be such an important financial cushion for people. Income is really important, but wealth is a little bit like a sleeper cell right now that is going to have a really big impact on people, especially as they get older and they start to retire. Those numbers all reflect the aggregate, but I do want to highlight a really important finding in our research, which is the black-white mobility gap. African Americans are less likely than whites to move out of the bottom over a generation. They're less likely to experience relative mobility, and they're also less likely to exceed their parents' family income than are whites. So they're less likely to experience upward absolute mobility. What I've done is focus on relative mobility here just to give you a sense of things. So what you can see is the blue bar shows that more than half of African American children raised at the bottom remain stuck at the bottom themselves of the income distribution, compared to just 1/3 of whites. And they're also much more likely than their white counterparts to fall out of the middle. So more than half who were raised in solidly middle-income homes fall out of the middle as adults, again, compared to just 1/3 of whites. And you'll notice that I've focused on here people at the bottom, people at the middle, nothing about African Americans at the top. And the reason is because there were so few African American parents in the top of the income distribution that we cannot get statistically reliable data about what happens to their kids. And that point alone underscores the profound differences in economic security, in income security, and wealth security that exists right now between African American families and all families of color and white families. So what's driving all of this? You know, aside from choosing parents at the top, how do you actually influence your economic mobility? Well, we at Pew have divided the indicators that matter for mobility into 3 capital buckets: financial capital, human capital, and social capital. Financial capital is all of the financial assets that a family has that they might be able to leverage to get ahead. So this is their savings, their wealth, their 401ks, their home equity. Human capital refers to the skills and attributes that somebody acquires that they can then leverage to get ahead. So this is typically things like education and health. And social capital refers to non-financial resources like the relationships that you have to people, to communities, to institutions that matter for your ability to get up and move up the economic ladder. So what I want to do today is provide you just a really brief example of each of these factors, sort of how the data play out, but also do a deeper dive on social capital and specifically what's happening in Charlotte and in North Carolina. So we'll start with financial capital. Our research has shown again and again that families will never be economically mobile if they're not first economically secure. And what's more, we've found a pretty strong relationship between the financial resources a family has, their wealth, their savings, and their ability to move up the income ladder. So we did some research not that long ago that looked at what distinguishes people who are stuck at the bottom over a generation from those who get out. So we were really focused on that 43%. The 43% that are raised at the bottom, that are stuck at the bottom, what matters for that stickiness versus the other nearly 60% that are raised at the bottom but manage to at least move up the income ladder a little bit. And what we found is that those who leave the bottom over a generation have 6 times higher savings, 8 times higher wealth, and 21 times higher home equity than their peers who remain stuck. So it's worth sort of disentangling this a little because it seems terribly intuitive. But unfortunately, it is not the case that if you put $200 in a savings account, you suddenly expect to get a raise at work. Right? It's not a causal relationship between the wealth that you have and then the income that you should expect. What we think is going on instead is that families that have some financial cushion are better protected from downward mobility when a financial emergency strikes, when their car breaks down, when the boiler breaks, when the radiator leaks. They actually have a little bit of cushion so that that doesn't become a catastrophe economically for them. But also we see that people who have a little bit of financial cushion are using that cushion in really mobility enhancing ways. They're investing in job training or education for themselves. They're moving to a better community. They're buying a car that allows them to get to a job that pays more. People inherently know how to move up the income ladder. And with a little bit of financial cushion, they do a really good job of getting themselves there. Moving on to human capital, our research has shown undoubtedly that a 4-year degree is hugely influential for upward economic mobility, both absolute mobility and relative mobility. What you're seeing here again is where people who are raised at the bottom end up if they have a 4-year degree or if they do not have a 4-year degree. And the largest points to take away from this slide are that of those raised at the bottom who get the 4-year degree, 90% of them leave the bottom, and they triple their chances of making it all the way to the top. I cannot stress strongly enough that you should ignore any stories in the media that say to you that a college degree is no longer worth it. The data do not back that up. The income, the wealth, the employer benefits that a person gets from even some post-secondary education absolutely is more powerful than the 3 people who are still in their parents' basements. Okay. I should say that our research has focused pretty exclusively on post-secondary education because we are looking at people's income and their earnings, their income, their wealth over time, so we need to look at them pretty far in their life. But there is really, really good evidence about early childhood education, really about education from 0 throughout the lifespan. So even while I'm focusing on post-secondary education, think about education really broadly when you think about mobility. Okay, so moving on to social capital. One element that gets talked about a lot is family structure. And there's been a lot of research that shows that single parents are more likely to live in poverty, that they have lower income, lower wealth than their married counterparts. And that is true. But I would really encourage you to think about family structure as well as all of these elements that I'm talking about in context with each other, and to specifically think about family structure in relationship to race and to education. So last year we released this web interactive, which is on our website, that sort of overlaid all of these things on top of each other. So it looked at race and education and the presence of children and marital status. It looked at all of it together, right? And said, what happens to people? What happens to these different family types? How do they experience mobility in terms of income and in terms of wealth? And this is what the interactive looks like. This slide is what you would see if you picked a white couple that does not have a college degree but does have children. And what you can see is that 89% of these families have higher income than their parents did at the same age. Over a third moved up at least one rung on the income ladder. And in the overall income distribution, these families are solidly situated in the middle. And this profile absolutely does show that being coupled matters significantly for holding on to the sort of income standing that your parents had and for potentially moving up the economic ladder. So let's see what happens when we actually just look at single white mothers, again, no college degree. For these, a majority have experienced downward mobility when compared to where they were raised. More than half have higher income than their parents did, but only 9% are actually able to move up a rung on the income ladder. 68% of these women actually moved down a rung on the income ladder relative to their parents. Okay, so what about Black single mothers without a college degree? 77% have higher family incomes than their parents did. More than 6 in 10, though, remain stuck at the bottom of the income ladder. Their median income is $15,700. It's a full $13,000 less than white single mothers without a college degree. So this underscores the important sort of factor that race is contributing when we think about single parenthood. Okay, so now what about Black single mothers who have a college degree? The story changes completely. A full 100% of them have higher family incomes than their parents did. 83% move up a rung on the income ladder. And their median income is more than double what single Black mothers without a college degree had. So just by virtue of having that college degree, suddenly this single mother is doing completely fine, both in terms of mobility and in terms of her standing within the economic distribution more broadly. So I say that because I think it is really, really important to think about all of these things in the way that they're interconnected and to not latch on to sort of one indicator as the thing, the silver bullet that matters for mobility, because unfortunately there is no silver bullet. Another really important element of social capital is geographic location, and there's been a lot of research recently that's able to pinpoint differences in mobility at the state level, the metro area level, and even the neighborhood level. And this is because new data is becoming available, and it allows us to do really good in-depth research at these sort of smaller geographic chunks. So far, the data that I have shown you has all compared individuals to their actual parents over time. But when we think about place and sort of social capital as it relates to states and localities, we're really looking at individuals over their own lifetimes, or maybe over, say, a 10-year period, because that's what the data allow us to do. So we conducted at Pew a state-by-state analysis of mobility, and we measured mobility 3 different ways. We looked at absolute earnings growth over time. We looked at the percent of people who started in the bottom half of the income distribution and moved up at least sort of 10 rungs, and the percent who started at the top and moved down 10 rungs. So we were looking at absolute earnings growth and then relative upward and relative downward mobility. We didn't have to look at absolute downward mobility because in every single state over the 10-year period, there has been earnings growth. Again, that goes to that, 83% of people having higher family incomes. What we found is that 8 states primarily in the Mideast and New England regions, which are marked here in green, had consistently better mobility than the national average. They had higher upward mobility and lower downward mobility than the nation as a whole. 9 states, all in the South, including North Carolina, had consistently worse mobility. So there was lower rates of upward absolute mobility, lower rates of earnings growth, and higher rates of downward mobility. Those states are all shown in red. All of the states in gray were basically statistically no different from the national average. So the states in green and the states in red are the ones that really stand out for either being better or for being worse. So let's look at the specifics of North Carolina and its neighboring states. The top row shows where the nation as a whole ended up, and you can see that 17% of that on the national average was 17% earnings growth over this 10-year period. 34% of people who started at the bottom of the income distribution managed to move up. About 28% who started at the top fell down over the 10-year period. North Carolina, on the other hand, was statistically worse than the national average in terms of its absolute mobility because it experienced only 14% earnings growth. Only 26% of people in North Carolina moved up from the bottom, so that was also worse than the national average. In terms of downward mobility, relative downward mobility, it was no different from the national average. Again, 28% fell down. So each of the states in the South that I grabbed here, I put the red bars next to the ones where they are statistically worse than the national average. And so what you can see is that this is absolutely bad news for North Carolina, but it's really bad news for this region as a whole. There is something going on that is making the South in general perform worse almost no matter how you measure mobility. As Brian mentioned, new research out of Harvard is also showing differences in economic mobility at the commuting zone level. The commuting zone is kind of like a metro area. You could think about it as the same thing. And based on their research, they looked at, the most mobile commuting zones in the United States and the least mobile commuting zones when we looked at the 50 largest, and Charlotte is at the bottom of the pile. So of course the logical explanation is why? Why would there be these big differences at the local level, at the state level? What matters? And not surprisingly, things that matter on the national level also matter at the local level. So educational attainment matters, labor market opportunities matter, family structure matters. But another really important thing that matters is economic segregation. So whether there are concentrated pockets of poverty and concentrated pockets of wealth within a metro area. So I'm not necessarily talking about income inequality, like how big of a difference is there between the wealthy and the poor. It's instead how big is the geographic divide between the wealthy and the poor. So let me give you an example. If you meet somebody today for the first time and you say to them, oh, what neighborhood do you live in? If their answer can immediately conjure up for you a sense of what their socioeconomic status is, then you live in an economically segregated place. And yes. And unfortunately, more and more of us are living in economically segregated places. This chart shows that rates of economic segregation have been on the rise consistently since the 1970s, and that's the case for small metro areas and large metro areas. Pretty much everybody is becoming more economically segregated. So let's look at Charlotte specifically. This figure is probably familiar to some of you because I borrowed it from a presentation that Rebecca Hefner from the city of Charlotte delivered to the city council a few weeks ago. The green areas are pockets of concentrated wealth, and the blue areas are pockets of concentrated poverty, with Mecklenburg County surrounded by that black line. Both research by Pew and by Harvard has shown that this kind of economic segregation is hindering economic mobility. So how much mobility are we talking? Well, so let's imagine there are two families. Both of them have incomes that is 1/2 of their metro area's mean. So they're definitely low income. The first family lives in a low mobility metro area. the second family lives in a high mobility metro area. On average, considering only the impact of living in a given metro area, it's going to take the descendants of family 1 a full 4 generations to get close to their metro area's mean income. For the descendants of family 2, it only takes 3 generations to get to that mean income. So why does economic segregation matter so much? Well, think about it like this. If you are in an economically segregated area, affluent parents, well, parents generally have lots of ways that they can sort of pass on advantage to their kids. But affluent parents have the added ability to move to a really well-off neighborhood. And that neighborhood carries with it all kinds of advantages, not least of which is the school system. But it also has lower rates of crime, higher rates of employed people, tons of mentors, tons of examples of people who are around, access to green space, access to good grocery stores, and on and on and on. For low-income families, they don't have that resource. They don't have that flexibility to move themselves necessarily out of their low-income neighborhood. Now let's imagine that the metro area is more economically segregated and all of the neighborhoods are more or less the same. Well, in that situation, a wealthy family, high-income family, doesn't need to move. All the neighborhoods are basically the same, so wherever they go, they go. But for the low-income families in that community, this is perfect for them from a mobility-enhancing perspective because they get all of the advantages that that upper-income family would otherwise have. So the school system is better, the crime rates are lower, the labor market opportunities are greater, and yada, yada, yada. So while it's not a very comfortable topic, the elephant in the room is that in many areas, and Brian's slide shows this as well, racial segregation is going hand in hand with economic segregation. Neighborhood poverty is a really important element of social capital and helps to explain part of why that black-white mobility gap exists. The chart on this slide shows the percentage of children living in high-poverty neighborhoods. So these are neighborhoods with at least a 20% poverty rate, which is very high nationally. 2/3 of black children are being raised in high-poverty neighborhoods compared to less than 10% of white kids. And this is a statistic that has not changed over the last 30 years. So the first set of bars show kids born between 1955 and 1970, and the second chart shows kids born between 1985 and 2000. So despite a profound civil rights movement, despite a lot of changes that have happened, where black families and white families live in terms of their poverty rates, it has not changed. What this means is that African American kids who are in solidly middle-income families are living in high-poverty neighborhoods, because it is not the case that 2/3 of black families are poor. That is not the case. And it is also not the case that only 6% of white families are poor. So this means that low-income white kids are living in low-poverty neighborhoods. So there's a complete, like, this goes totally beyond income. This is just about where people live. And that is so critical because if you remember back to this slide I showed that more than half of African Americans fall out of the middle, living in a high-poverty neighborhood during childhood alone can explain between 1/4 and 1/3 of that black-white gap in downward mobility out of the middle. That sounds small, but in social science terms, that's huge. That means that neighborhood poverty is more important for explaining the black-white mobility gap than parents' occupation, parents' education, and individuals' education, and sort of other personal attributes combined. Being in a high-poverty neighborhood increases the chances of downward mobility by 52%. On the other hand, reducing concentrated poverty can make a huge difference. African American children who lived in neighborhoods where poverty declined had significantly greater economic success in adulthood. Okay, so The bottom line here is that there really is no silver bullet to enhancing economic mobility, because there's not really any one cause for stickiness at the top, and there's not any one cause for stickiness at the bottom. So let's just take neighborhoods as an example. They matter for all the reasons that you know intuitively that they would or should matter. Poor communities have higher rates of crime. They have lower access to libraries. They have lower access to green space and good grocery stores. The school systems are not as well funded. There aren't as many labor market opportunities. There aren't as many mentors and people in the community that can serve as beacons of what is possible. It isn't just one of those things that matter. It isn't just that improving the school system or reducing the crime rate or putting in a grocery store, that would sort of solve the problem. All of these things matter, and they matter simultaneously, and they sort of collapse in on themselves in a way that enhances disadvantage. I think about this a lot like an onion. There are lots and lots of layers that are all combined together, and it's really important to think about them as being intermingled. They are all connected. Almost all policy attempts to attack the problem of poverty or mobility or inequality or whatever with one sort of goal in mind. So for example, if a family doesn't have enough money to buy food, they can get access to food stamps. That has a specific set of eligibility requirements. That's a specific line to stand in. That's a specific office you go to. If that same family needs cash assistance, they have to go to a completely different office with a different line and different eligibility requirements. In order to qualify for cash assistance, they probably need to be working. And that's a totally different office that helps them think about job training and education. And if they happen to have kids, which many of them do, then they have to go somewhere else to think about childcare supports if they exist. So it's complicated at best and intentionally difficult at worst for people to actually navigate the system of getting support. It isn't that policymakers, I think, are malicious. They're just not thinking about the fact that putting all of this in one place and recognizing that a family has holistic needs, that all of these things are related, makes more sense. The other thing that public policy and many programmatic interventions fail to do is to see the family holistically. So some programs direct lots of support to low-income kids for high-quality education and center-based childcare. There is so much research backing that up. That is a really good thing to do. But what happens to those kids when they go home? And then on the flip side, a lot of programs help parents try to get them into job training programs, try to get them into career training, try to get them to a place where they're making more money, where that family can be earning a family supporting wage. Also, completely backed up by rigorous data, also seems like the logical thing to do. But what happens to those people's kids when they're trying to get that job training and education? Where do they go? I'm not trying to say that all programs need to be all things to all people, because that wouldn't make sense. And I also don't mean to suggest that there's not a lot of coordination that already happens across programs, because for sure that coordination does happen in many cases. What I do want you to think about, though, as you're going through this learning session, as you're thinking about your line of work, what you do within the community, as you're applying sort of a mobility lens to that, to think about how you can coordinate services, coordinate programs, and coordinate a response that understands that the family often has two generations, and that two-generation intervention, or three, that recognizing all of the needs of all the family members at the same time is really important. You cannot focus only on the parents or only on the kids or only on the grandparents, because they're all in it together. I don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time on this, because I do want to make sure that we have an opportunity for discussion, but I think it could be helpful to sort of talk through some of the policy implications of the research that we've done. So our project at Pew does not conduct advocacy. We are focused on sort of building a fact base and putting it in front of policymakers and putting it in front of the media. But we have been fortunate to work with a very diverse group of stakeholders who represent sort of all sides of the political spectrum within think tanks in Washington, D.C. And a few years ago, we worked with them to develop a policy roadmap. So we're talking about people who are sort of far right in some cases, far left in some cases, sort of in the middle in some cases. And we gave them 2 rules. We said, you have to come up with policy recommendations that you all unanimously agree on, and you also have to come up with policy recommendations that are actually rooted in the data. So recognizing that we all want to do a lot of things, we want our policy recommendations to actually have some empirical evidence behind them. We thought maybe they would come up with a handful of recommendations, but in reality, there's way more agreement than even we thought, and they came up with 22 policy recommendations that span the human, social, and financial capital buckets. From the very beginning, they agreed on a set of goals within their document, which really guided what got in and what sort of got left by the wayside. First, they really wanted to promote mobility for everyone, but they wanted especially focused on Americans at the bottom of the income distribution. And second, they called for, it was not redistribution for anyone in this room. It was a portfolio shift I'm not kidding, in federal expenditures so that they are more geared towards promoting mobility and more geared towards promoting mobility among the people that actually need the mobility boost. So just as a sort of a quick example, quick run through of the things that they included, in the human capital section, it was everything from promoting early childhood development to better access to college and completion to job training for low-skilled adults. Social capital talked a lot about reorienting public assistance programs so that they provided a better and more complete safety net for families. They wanted to focus on family formation and teen pregnancy reduction, responsible fatherhood, and neighborhoods, of course. In the financial capital section, they wanted to really encourage savings, encourage financial literacy and retirement savings, and in light of the recession and everything related to homeownership, they actually felt that homeownership needed to be preserved as a safe and secure savings vehicle for families. Since this document was produced, there has been some progress made on the federal side in some of the policy recommendations that they put forward. For example, President Obama has initiated this Promised Neighborhoods initiative, which is based very much on the idea that you need to meet people where they are within communities and develop community, sort of economic development of the whole family at the same time, focusing on schools. However, it probably will come as no surprise to anyone in this room that in a lot of cases there really has been no movement on any of these policies. And actually, I think perhaps the better place for these kinds of interventions to occur is at the state and local level. There is a lot of gridlock in DC. It just is what it is. But states actually have a lot of power to be innovators and to recognize the unique strengths and weaknesses of their locality, either at a state level or a local level, and to use sort of this roadmap as a way of figuring out which policy interventions actually make sense here or here or here. I'm going to end by sharing just a few lessons learned as you're launching this learning session. So our goal, as I said, is not to conduct direct advocacy, but instead to educate policymakers, to educate the public, and to encourage everyone to just overlay an economic mobility lens onto the things that they're doing. We want there to be an informed debate. We want there to be a good discussion happening with reliable facts and data that help people make good decisions, good policy decisions. Since I think that's very similar to what you also could be moving towards doing, I think some of these lessons hopefully will be helpful. So first lesson learned is to get everyone at the table, get diverse stakeholders at the table. The more the merrier. It's really, really important that you not be preaching to the choir, in sort of doing these efforts. And I can tell you that in our experience working with people, thought leaders, advocates from across the political spectrum has been instrumental in making sure that we adhered to the fact base, that we heard everybody's opinions, that the research was able to be communicated to everyone. It has opened so many doors for us on Capitol Hill, both Democratic doors and Republican doors. It has really, really made a difference to the outcome of our research. Getting to some kind of compromise is better than pure gridlock. Second, because you're here, you are clearly interested in opportunities to discuss and learn and collaborate. So keep doing that. You have to be able to sort of talk about these things and get people at the table and keep sort of pounding the pavement with each other to figure out what exactly you want to do and how you can work together to do it. Some of the things that we have done to foster conversation has been, we started an economic mobility caucus in the U.S. Senate, and we regularly host briefings as part of that caucus. Again, not around specific policy or advocacy, but just different topics that we know have a mobility lens, that have policy implications, as a way of educating people, creating a platform for conversation. The other thing that we've done is we hold lunches that are just for reporters, where they learn from experts, and we're trying to help them use a mobility angle in all of their reporting. So this spans the gamut. It's when they're reporting on mass incarceration or when they're reporting on early childhood education, we want them to be thinking about economic mobility. Third, language matters a lot. The semantics matter a lot. Pew made a very conscious decision to not talk about income inequality at all because it's really politically divisive. It can be very polarizing. And we decided instead to focus on economic mobility because neither party owns the American dream. This is something that public polling has shown again and again Americans care deeply about. That cuts across party lines. It's a really important and unifying concept and framework to be using. Finally, it's really important to come to some consensus about what the problem is and how you would define success. And that seems sort of overly simple, except that just a couple of weeks ago, I was at this meeting with a lot of people from different sort of political affiliations, and we were all having a conversation about economic mobility and where could there be agreement in the next Congress, where could we do something on mobility. And it was pretty far into the conversation before somebody said, I'm not sure we all agree on what the problem is. And he might have been right. You know, I think people come to the table with an assumption of what the problem is and with an assumption of what the right intervention is, and that can cause unnecessary confusion. So nail that down in the beginning. Okay, I am going to stop there. Thank you so much for your interest in our work and for listening for so long. Thank you.